And we are live. Welcome, everybody. So excited to see everybody here today. We are streaming to a ton of different channels. So welcome wherever you all are tuning in from. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on X at Lady Lee or on LinkedIn at Tracy S. Lee. I will introduce myself after I go ahead and have our guests introduce ourselves. So playing the Brady Bunch, I think, David, let's go ahead and go with you first.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a member of technical staff at Anthropic and one of the co-creators of MCP. Handing it over to Harald.
Oh, I'm Harald. I'm on the VS Code team and focusing on MCP, customization all up, the agentic experience, and have been early on in the MCP steering committee as well. Handing it off to James to go crisscross on my screen.
Great. James Montemagno. I am at Microsoft as well. I work with Harald. I work on a different team than Harald. I work on our developer community team inside of our developer division. So we build all the tools, languages, and frameworks, and we help developers be successful adopting technologies. And one of my passions is talking about MCP, adopting MCP, building MCPs. I'm actually here in Lisbon currently. I actually just gave an MCP talk and an MCP workshop, and just the general excitement from developers is astonishing, and I love it. So really excited to be here and excited to talk about MCP goodness. Last but not least, I hand it over to Dominik.
Hi, I'm Dom. I work on developer experience at OpenAI. So I work on, among other things, the Agents SDK and making sure that developers are successful with OpenAI.
Good. Well, thank you, all for doing introductions. So again, my name is Tracy. I'm the CEO of a company called This.Labs. For those of you who aren't familiar with This. We just really believe in bringing the ecosystem together. So with everything going on around AI, this event actually started with a conversation from Harald. Harald and I don't know if we met at Browser Contributor Days, but like I still remember Facebook, like Facebook reminding me that like so many years ago we did the Browser Contributor Days together with Adi Osmani. So, when we were talking, I was like, wow, we should probably do a state of MCP. This is stuff that everyone cares about and everything. So This. Has a YouTube channel. You can check out all of our YouTube videos, This.media. We have a modern web podcast. We also are incredibly passionate right now about just helping developers with figuring out how to be the most productive when it comes to developer tooling and just like everything happening. So feel free to always hit me up about anything, and we're happy to get you plugged into the community. So MCP, this is just such a hot topic. I hear it on Twitter 24/7, everyone talking about MCP this, MCP that. If we talk about just the core problem that MCP is actually trying to solve, maybe we can start there. David, you're the co-creator, so maybe you can kick us off there. And then maybe also just how has the definition evolved, if at all, since the inception?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I'm curious what the others have to say about how they perceive the problem, because when projects become large enough, how people perceive the problem that they're solving can be quite different. For me, it basically, there's this inherent problem of that you have people building different AI applications, be it for us like Cloud Desktop, be it Cloud AI, other people building IDEs like VS Code, Zed, and others. And one of the core problems we had even early at Anthropic ourselves is that you often want to have people build for integration for these, because they know the type of like problems that they're facing the best, but they don't want to do it like with one proprietary API for like one specific interface, because they want to reuse, I don't know, like integrations into, let's say, Jira or Sentry in Cloud AI, but they also want to use it in VS Code at the same time. And so this is like a classic N times M problems, where you have N types of clients and M types of integration. And that leads itself to a protocol. And in our case, the protocol that influenced us the most was LSP, the language server protocol for Microsoft, which has solves a very similar problem at a different scale nowadays, but a similar problem. And so that's how I perceive what we're trying to solve, is integration at scale for N clients and AI applications to M integrations. And the definition is, I think, the definition itself has not changed much, but I think the scope has changed. The initial work when we initially launched it, when we initially built it, it was a very developer centric integration flow, and you can, I think, trace the origins, particularly at the early days, how widely standard I/O servers, so local servers, were used and built, and the initial versions were all about standard I/O servers. And I think that has slowly shifted away to focuses of just general integrations, and that can be on the consumer side, and we're seeing, like, we can talk about this later, additional patterns on top of that from OpenAI, and this also, like, is now like a scope of like enterprise integrations where you see a lot of MCP being built as well. So the scope has changed, but I think the inherent problem hasn't changed that we're trying to solve. That's my take, but I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is the biggest value that I've seen through for MCP is like the discoverability part, right? And like being able to have like a very standardized way of having agents understand what are the tools that are actually available for an agent to be used.
Yeah, I think that reflects me for like how the scope changed is all these other use cases that people discovered for MCP. Like initially it was very much like, how can I give my local Cloud desktop, my local VS Code context of like what needs to look at, and it's very fine access, like you still need to approve, and it's like it's very manual. So because you're on a machine, like, and you don't want to like access things the agent should look at for the answer. But then like now there's this like whole agent to agent system that's been popping up, people trying to solve these hard problems where it's like how they can run as autonomous as possible, how they can just discover from the vast tools that would be ever available. So the scale has just exploded in that regard, from like local person installing MCP and like getting the value out of it to a whole agentic ecosystem.
I think what David described is like the thing that I describe in every talk that I give on it. And I always like to really double down on the fact of like being able to provide not just context back to the models, but also give a way that potentially these models can interact with additional actions behalf of the user with their permission. And I think that when I show the ability to iterate and work with a model, maybe on a bug that I'm working on in my code, and look at the stack trace that's coming up as a developer, or I'm ideating on a trip, for example, that I'm about to take, and I want it to be able to not only just search and scour the information that it has in its knowledge base, but also be able to find real-time information and pull that back, and then ideate with it to put it into something structured in a way, right? You take a bunch of unstructured logs, you put them into a structured log, describe the bug, and then say, okay, now let's do something on my behalf, right? Let's create a GitHub issue. Let's iterate on this design 5 different times, come up with 5 different use cases. And the model's really fast, really fluid. So be able to have that universal standard, that USB-C connector, in a way that enables these tools and prompts and resources, and standardize the authentication model as well as it's evolved. That I think is really powerful, especially for developers, but outside of developers as well, solving these different problems. And when I talk to enterprises, it's, we have all these different tools that we've written in a bunch of different programming languages. How are we going to even think about standardizing the way that we expose these tools and this data and these processes to all the clients that we're building, or the clients that we're using internally or potentially externally? So I think all those problems have continued to evolve. And I think that it has evolved into, how do we do it not only just on our machine, but now remotely as well, and how do we scale that, and how do we think about authentication as well? So it's looking to solve many different aspects from what it started. And I think the discoverability is the new piece that I think is really a game changer as well. Just like we have NPM, just like we have NuGet, we have these feeds of sources, just like we have search engines that can now help us with these different problems. And to me, the superpower is also that ability to take actions, whether it's opening a browser and clicking around with Playwright or Chrome DevTools, for example, or opening GitHub issues or Jira issues or something like that. I think that is a magic moment when it all comes together, because I could do it in the IDEs, right? I could do it. And I open today. I'm like, I can go to the GitHub thing in VS Code, and I can say new issue, and there's like a template for me to fill out, or go to github.com. But like, I don't want to do that. I don't have time. I mean, I do have time, but I'd like to ideate and have it, put it in the perfect format, and it'll think of new things that I can review and approve much faster than I ever could.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that we've gotten back to solving fun problems. Like this is what I love about all of these new technologies and sort of these new standards that are coming out. It goes back to sort of like the early web days when it's like wild, wild west, like we're trying to figure it out. I love it so much. David and Harald, you all mentioned things about the steering committee, and really quickly, we don't have to go over it too much, but maybe just a quick, like, how does the steering committee work and how are the specs made? Like what goes into the thinking process there?
Yeah, so the steering committee is a combination of different roles inside the governance of the project. So the project is open source, it's like under the MIT license, but then who's going to make the decisions? And we have, I don't know, like April, May, around that time. But until then, it basically was like Justin and me doing whatever we want to do. And we adopted a governance model that's very heavily inspired by the PyTorch model. And it's effectively like there is a group of core maintainers, and which are 8 people from OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, AWS, and Anthropic, who effectively vote on proposals that anybody can make to the specification. These proposals require someone of the maintainer group to be to shepherd it, and if you do not find someone from the maintainer group, then you don't get it. It will never be voted on. And the maintainers is a wide group of people working on clients, working on the SDKs, working on working groups or interest groups. It's a fairly long list of like probably, I don't know, 30 people or something like that. I lost count. It's a sizable amount of people. That's the maintainers. Then these 8 core maintainers that make the final decision. Then myself, I am the so-called lead core maintainer, which effectively gives me veto rights on anything in the project. So the project is technically a BDFL model, but has so far never been used in that way, and is purely like these 8 people making the decisions in the end of the day. And then the SDKs, all these like part of the projects that are not the specification, be it documentation, be it community management, be it the SDKs themselves, they are mostly maintained by their respective groups. Like, for example, Microsoft does a really good job at maintaining the C# SDK. The Java SDK is maintained by people from Spring, the Kotlin SDK by people from JetBrains, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of help from companies and people who honestly know their particular ecosystem better than we do.
I love that. That's such great insight. Thank you so much. I feel like a lot of this stuff often, from an outsider point of view, is this
Right.
sort of very master, like, well, how is this happening? What is happening? So just understanding a little bit of insider baseball is so helpful.
Yeah, and it's a bit tricky to understand, like, and but it is an open source project. It's an open source project that has a lot of attention at the moment. So there's mechanics in place where people might accidentally have to wait a long time to get attention for their changes. But we're trying to get better, and we're trying to make this as open as possible with the resources we have. And so, yeah, it's really tries to be like, if you have a good idea, you should be able to bring it to the table. You just need to convince someone from the group that it's worthwhile paying attention to. And if you have done that, then eventually core maintainers will vote on it. And yeah, and that's it.
It's like all open source projects, basically.
It's very open source project. The tricky part is I think we're a little bit faster paced than the average open source project. And that's, I think, the main challenge here. Which is also why we opted for that model over other models that are available that are even slower paced.
David, maybe a question for folks. Like, I personally always loved reading sort of like TC39 proposals and like understanding where they're in the state to like become JavaScript standards. Like, how do people actually find like what are the current things that are being proposed?
Oh yeah, it's all in GitHub issues. Everything is in a Model Context Protocol organization in GitHub issues with a tag called SEP, because we call these specification enhancement proposals. That's really the main driver. And Yeah, and then some of the things I personally propose, I honestly like they're a little bit like a bit less low key, a bit more low key, and not exactly as perfectly through the governing model that I've put in place by myself. But that's sometimes the benefit you get.
Makes sense. I love that. And then, Harold, I know you're on the steering committee too, and I know Microsoft has been maybe a little bit involved in spec work and things like that. Do you want to talk a
Yeah,
little bit about
Microsoft
that?
is one of the core maintainers. If I did not, I think I might have
Yep.
forgotten mentioning that. Microsoft, AWS, Google, OpenAI, and Anthropic. Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then to caveat my involvement, I'm probably the least involved from all the people I know involved with the steering committee work. So we have Dan from Microsoft side on all of the auth and security work. From the VS Code team, Connor and Tyler and others have been really involved with SEPs on like client integration and authentication as well. So depending on like what area an engineer owns in VS Code that touches MCP, then they're also kind of looking at the ongoing SEPs and improvements landing. From the VS Code side, especially, I think we've been really interested in making sure we have support the cutting edge of the spec, because it's really hard to drive adoption of anything if there's no actual client to implement it. So just yesterday, I think one of the SEPs landed, and Tyler in our stand-up show, like, it's now working VS Code Insiders. So just that tight, like, it's coming down the pipeline. We're having an eye on it. Like, and that's a lot of work we see from the VS Code side. Kind of people coming with proposals of like, this would be a cool addition to the spec. And once it's a proposal that's being discussed, clients can already start potentially trying it out. So you have an idea of how it feels like, how it could work. And then it's easier to kind of have that conversation around like, what is the next step here? Is this working? So that's where we see like the VS Code role. One is kind of being the reference client for everything that's like fully in the spec, that's compliant. And the feedback there is really amazing. We're talking to a few people on like, yes, I now only test in VS Code to see like if the things needs to work, authentication, transport, all these tricky bits. And then if it works in VS Code, I'll probably have some high confidence that it works everywhere as well. Like, you should still test everywhere, but I think it's there's a vast growing ecosystem now of MCP clients, so you cannot test everywhere. So having a good reference integration matters. And then really helping with the spec as well. Yep.
Yeah, I think that the interesting part there is like we try as a project be like super practical and like super like code matters a lot. It gives like the VS Code team, for example, has a lot of voice in the project because they're so early adopting, and because they're the ones that trying out the specification is the ones that we then often listen to when it comes to like, is this viable? Is this not viable? And so that's the power of being engaged and being like very on the forefront of like adoption, and both on the SDK side, but also on the client side.
And I think the steering committee part is really important when I talk to developers and I talk to customers and enterprises, because, and then it's also all done in the open, kind of like David was talking about the process and how these communities come together. Because when it comes to any new technology, like if I'm the one presenting the technology, or I'm sure Dom's presenting, or David's presenting, it can make it seem like this is a OpenAI technology, this is only an Anthropic, or this is only a Microsoft technology. So literally the first slide that I have is a definition of MCP, and then I have all the members, like, you know, created by Anthropic, and then all the members of the steering committee and how it all works to describe it. And I think that's like eye-opening to a lot of people, and then tell them just to go to the GitHub and they can go through every single thing that's happening and be part of it. And I think that's what's really exciting about it, as everyone's been saying, because you can be part of it as well, and you can follow along as it's evolving.
Yeah, one of the fun parts there is like some of the like, you know, people working together across company lines. Like yesterday, we had a new proposal that is literally written by OpenAI and Anthropic together, and I think that's like quite unique and really fun to have that kind of work.
Yeah, I feel like I regularly encounter developers that are like surprised, like, oh wait, like OpenAI works on like MCP stuff and uses MCP, isn't that from Anthropic? So like I'm personally super excited that we're collaborating on these things.
I think that's so important. Even what David said, right? Like you listing off the sort of folks who are involved. I think we are maybe all learning from each other. You know, I feel like, you know, 10 years ago, right? Oh, this is from Google. Oh, this is from, you know, this is from Meta, right? But the fact that everyone's collaborating, I think makes it a lot stickier. And I think we've learned over time that's what really makes something work in an ecosystem. So I love that.
I think it helps with the adoption of it, like Harald was saying, right? I think that when we all push on something together, especially as things are changing so fast, and you show, like in my demo, I open up 4 different IDEs, I open up 4 different tools, I talk about an entire slide of here's all the different tools, not just in Azure, but also like how OpenAI is doing and how Anthropic is doing, like how you can just, and Google's doing, like how you can plug these in. That eye-opening moments as well. I can build this one thing, because a lot of developers I talked to, they've all gone that route of, oh, I want this special thing over here in VS Code. I got it. Oh, even another Microsoft tool like Visual Studio, I have to build something different, right? And I think that eye-opening moment as well, when it's like, oh wow, it actually does just plug in everywhere.
Yeah, I think leading us into sort of this idea for those who are sort of still adopting, because I think a lot of people, are still sort of saying like, okay, MCP, this is this new thing, I need to learn this. So are there any sort of like misunderstood aspects of MCP among new adopters, and how is that confusion being addressed?
Yeah, I can take a stab. I did a talk at AI Engineering World Fair of like, y'all holding it wrong. So there is a big part of MCP being stateful and very contextual, or it can be at least. There's a layer of like, oh, it's tools. It's the way you provide the agent with tools, and that's what most people use it for. Which limits then like, oh, why isn't this just an API? Why isn't this just a CLI tool? Like it could be all these other things, where as the spec itself has very many other many powerful primitives that allow you to make it very stateful and very contextual, and even hook into the LLM, basically running the tool to run more LLM calls in a prep call. So a lot of these things people have a hard time wrapping their head around if they just think about tools. So I think that's a big part of how do you make use of the rest of the spec for your use case. Like not just like, maybe that's starting with tools. Maybe you just wrap your API that you already have inside tools. But I'm thinking like, how can resources work? How can I use sampling to reduce context that I send back? How can I use citations to maybe ask for confirmation or some additional information so I don't do another turn with the LM. Really love what OpenAI has been doing with the kind of MCP UI approach. There's so many things are coming to the spec that we have to rethink completely, like what is MCP doing in your stack? What is it driving? And that's what I find is often lost in messaging, especially initially. Now I think it's getting a bit easier, where people talk about more. It's easier to test, more clients have it, but it takes time.
David, I saw a smile there.
Yeah, here's the thing. This is complicated because, of course, when you design these type of things, you have use cases in mind, and some of the things that are in the specification that are actually the least used are the ones that we used the most, and when we originally developed it, like prompts, right? Like I was at the time used an editor that had like a very raw AI integration, and prompts matched really nicely to like slash commands at the time there. And so I use this quite a lot, but it's like very underused everywhere else. And I think there's an aspect here where two ways. I think there's a principled approach of like, what would you want the world to be? And then there's the like, what does the world actually do with the stuff you have done? And at some point you need to find some middle ground where like, I want to educate a little bit in a certain direction. And I think that's working. People are using more parts of the feature of the specification. I think elicitation is something that is becoming increasingly like asked for and more widely used. But then, for example, other things like resources have been underused until now with Apps SDK and MCP UI, where it suddenly is like a quite nice approach for them to ship HTML over the wire. And so now have I think there will be like a bit of a renaissance for that type of feature, as much as you can say that for a protocol that's not even a year old. But so I think I'm trying to just be very practical and be very mindful to like, how much do people actively use this every day, and what is the de facto thing people will use? Where do I see this going, and what decisions do I need to make? because these things all happen together. Like there's a lot of discussion around statelessness, and this fits into like if everybody only uses tools, then statelessness is a very practical thing, but it's not so practical if you do have assumptions like elicitations. So I'm trying to meet people between where they are currently and where I would love them to be, and where I think the things are going, and just trying to like, don't be too dogmatic about like this is the one way. That never works. People have always been too creative about the tools you've given them, and MCP is a very composable tool, and as a result, people will use it in new, unique ways that you didn't anticipate, and they will not use things you wish you had anticipated they will use it for. That's just the name of the game.
Yeah, I definitely, I definitely feel that. Do you feel like there needs to be more education, sort of like right now at this point in time, of what is MCP? How do you use it? Sort of like more high level talks and education, or are we sort of getting down to the, hey, we sort of need to educate the individual developer on like, here's how you implement, or here's how you create one. Is it more the sort of, again, creating MCP side of things as well, or is it more like the consuming side of MCP things, or are those two problems sort of being solved in parallel?
I mean, I'll at least talk. I'm super interested from all aspects, but like, I will say every blog, every video, every session, every workshop, it is just off the charts. The interest levels, the amount of people showing up to learn just what MCP is, how they integrate it into their workflow, why would they create one, how do they create one, how do they deploy them, where do they deploy them, how they take advantage of their existing APIs. Every survey I've done in the last 6 months or 5 months since build, where basically no hands went up about what they've heard of it, never knew anything about how it worked or XYZ. Yeah, now we're at like 30 or 40%. So I think the education of what it is, how you use it, because I think the tools have evolved, like the use cases have continued to evolve. And I think it's different for different audiences. If you go talk to a testing group versus developers versus consumers versus, they're going to use it in a different way. And I think just now we're coming to that peak where discoverability, installability, connectability, authentication is really come really more mature than ever to ease adoption. So I still think a lot of base knowledge, and then a lot of folks understanding how I think people obviously understand like more how APIs work, but now they're, okay, what's the security model? Where is this running? How is this running? Is it on my machine? Is it not on my machine? And I would say that we need to be teaching what it is today, not what it was 6 months ago.
I think I was just gonna say, I think like the discoverability and like the authentication part are like two very big things that like I'm seeing sort of change a lot of like what is available now, because like as David was saying, right, like they're like a lot of the original like MCPs were all standard IO ones, and like you would really have to be a developer, at least I feel comfortable like setting those things up. And a lot of the most supported clients were like code editors, right? Like the amount of times that I've seen people like pop up like Cursor or something or VS Code to like go and use an MCP that had like nothing to do with code just because it was like a good client, versus like then we went to the state of like, well, now you can like run one, but there's like an API key that you have to get, and like that's not really going to fare for consumers who, especially in an enterprise use case, have to go and like ask like an admin to get an API key. Like, not going to happen. And then now I think like now sort of like going to like OAuth 2.1 and like having actual like user-friendly authentication, I think is going to change a lot of this. Plus like the more like Claude and ChatGPT like consumer interfaces having MCP support.
Yeah, I guess that goes into the sort of idea of, friction blockers to wider adoption, right? So, are there any sort of big unlocks that you see like, hey, this needs to happen in order for us to have wider adoption. Dom, you mentioned this idea of authentication, right? Like a lot of MCPs don't have OAuth, this whole idea of needing API keys. I'll throw in there that, the GitHub MCP is one of the most popular MCP servers right now. I mean, maybe let's just have a conversation around all that. How do we get to the next level? What's the friction?
Yeah, I think from my side, the main conversations I have when I talk about MCP to like larger customers, one customer is it's always Auth. it's always like the joke is like the S in MCP is about security, so there's a security bit to it. Auth is still hard. Auth has been always hard. It's not new to MCP that Auth is hard. But there's also more things landing in the spec, and that was like one of the biggest changes in the spec since it came out was like improving the stance on Auth and making it easier to use, not basically pushing all the burden onto the developer, but having the clients do the heavy lifting, which on the VS Code side works like we do Auth for forever, and it's a really good flow in this case. Like we know what not to do, what not to store, like how to do it, how to follow the OAuth spec. So as a developer, it's still struggle, like how to get it right. And there's a bunch of stuff and that's the scale, right? You want to have a hosted server and everybody can, you don't want to install necessarily to get to that broad scale of just like, I want to talk to this URL. There's a service over here. It has an MCP. I just want to use it. And I think to that level of just like one click, you authenticate, you get the value out of it. I think that's where we're slowly getting there, and not giving a server too much scope out of the box. There's a spec that landed just 2 weeks ago at SEP to have 2-level scoping. So all these little bits that make it just more secure, easier to use, especially for critical use cases. And that's something where it goes like beyond developers, where like I can run anything on my machine, to the kind of consumer audience that doesn't care about MCP. They just want to get that integration layer with everything. That's kind of my take, where I see the biggest evolution. And then there's all these little details, like the polish of like, should we have icons? Because like in consumer products, you don't want to have this like CLI experience of like tool calling. You want to have it feel like it's doing something.
We have icons now, Harald.
Yeah, I know. There's icons now. It's like these little things where I talk to like really consumer facing products is like, this MCP thing is just too basic for our UI. We want to have it pretty. It needs to like integrate with our UI. So it's these small things as well.
I think what's interesting is, to that point, even about icons, is like, how much is it is MCP in the consumer's face versus hidden behind the application that they're using? You think of Figma, right? Like the MCP is like in the app in a developer mode that's exposed. You have it there. I think it's unrealistic to expect, my mom to install Python to run an MCP server to connect to something, right? That's not realistic in general. I mean, she could do it, I guess. I might be on tech support to help out there, but I think that easeability of all the things that we've talked about here. But I think there's also some of the built-inness, and I've started to see this actually in a few extensions in VS Code and in Visual Studio. Actually just install MCP servers that make sense, like the Microsoft Learn MCP server that can search the documentation is with Visual Studio 2026. It's just there. And then the system prompt is understanding, hey, listen, you're probably a .NET developer using Visual Studio 2026. You probably want to be able to search all the .NET documentation. Amazing, right? Or even just surfacing up the polish, right? I think the icons are a polish piece. I think right now it's a polishing piece of, I go in to an IDE, I go to a web page. What's the experience of reading the docs, looking at the changelog, that trust level, right? It seems silly about icons, but actually there's a reason that if you go to the App Store on any of the operating systems, there's a trust level of that professionalism of what's the appcon, what's the title, what's the description, what's the images, right? We build this trust, whether an icon or not it means nothing about trust, right? But something in our subconscious sees that, oh, this is a badge of approval because I see that it has the OpenAI logo on it, or I see the Microsoft logo on it, or the Anthropic logo, or this product. I can see that the URL is authenticated, so I trust, right? So I think all those layers will only help adoption wider, whether it is running on your machine, it's inside of an extension, that is just configuring it for you, or inside of another application that's exposing MCP servers as well. So, but I think that what I am seeing now is a little bit of a trend of you're using maybe an app in an app, for example, and it's using an MCP server to make it easier, right? Or I'm using Power Apps or Logic Apps, which are using these connectors, right, and doing automation, and they are using MCP. So inherently, the automation is running. I don't care what it's using and connecting to. It's another tool in my toolbox.
Yeah, in my mind, I think I agree that I think authorization is one of the biggest part to that, and I think that's where we put the most focus on, because we do want to have basically like a universal plug and play system, which is very, very hard to get right. And for example, we're hitting the boundaries of what OAuth is meant for, and we're literally working with people in the authorization standardization group to improve the specification to make it work for MCP. And I think that just shows that we are there on the bleeding edge, but I think it's improving. I think part of that is the specification, as other people said. Part of it is on the client side and the ecosystem side in general. There's things that I believe the market will solve, like there more and more cloud providers will make OAuth very easy to implement and use, and I think that will be a big unlock for people. I think there are other aspects that slowly pop up in general problems. There's like quality of servers is a big concern in general. It's very hard to understand how to build a good server. There's a lot of patterns that people advertise very widely, such as like mapping OpenAPI specifications into MCP that are actually very well-known anti-patterns and shouldn't be done for very good reasons, and usually lead to the model being very confused. And I think that's part of that, where there needs to be education, but there needs to also be good frameworks that help people to figure out like what makes a good MCP server, be it best practices, be it evaluation frameworks, be it debuggability of things that like take time to build and build well, and that ecosystem needs that time. And again, we're 11 months into MCP. Another aspect I think is getting increasingly important is this amount of like tool discovery, and like how do I deal with a lot of tools in a lot of MCP servers. This, I think, is something that where people ask the protocol for a lot of input, but I do actually personally believe this is more something where clients are asked to do more and can do more and can distinguish itself from others in being very, very good at automatically selecting the right tools at the right time. And that all will lead to like an increasingly smoother development, smoother user experience, which then inherently leads to more developers building for it. There's small other bits and pieces, like I think the statelessness and like how do you deploy servers at scale, I think is a question because of the statefulness. There are solutions like Cloudflare and others have fast MCP cloud, and others have some have some solutions in the space, and many other cloud providers. So we see more of that. And then there's like minute things like context management is still a tricky bit. But I think these things are all things on the protocol side that we can figure out. I think a lot of it is still on the ecosystem and exploring what MCP can do. And I think we're very early still in that phase. One of the examples that we might jump in later is, for example, we put into MCP quite deliberately this thing of structured output based on Eric Myers, a fairly famous computer scientist, input on this. And it took months for people to figure out that you can use this to generate type signatures and interact and basically use this as calling it from code that you can put into like that the model can generate. That's the code pilled or whatever you call this. What is the blog post from Cloudflare called? Like code, whatever, MCP, something with code and MCP. And so I think there's like still a lot of evolution of like what you can actually do with this thing that is just in the exploration phase. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's interesting because when you talk about it, David, it reminds me of sort of like two different types of ecosystems, right? If we just even take back like React saying, hey, we're not going to be opinionated, even back in the day saying, hey, we're just a library. And then, all of a sudden you see this huge ecosystem. I mean, we wouldn't have the React ecosystem and all the different libraries and support if they weren't, they weren't unopinionated. But then you see something like the Angular ecosystem, for example, which is much more opinionated and where, where people are looking for that. So I'm curious to just see in the next, 7 to 10 years, just how all of this evolves generally. Chris was saying that, and I can't remember who was saying this, but the idea that, there's a lot of sort of anti-patterns. There's a lot of people saying like, hey, here's how you do it. And it is a very big question of what do you trust? So, how standard are the practices now? What would you recommend for people to go to as a trusted source of learning this stuff, if any?
Modelcontextprotocol.io. It's a great website that will guide you through the open source projects. That's a great question. I mean, I think that, compared to, the AI Engineering Summit in February, right? I guess that would be like month 2 or so of MCV. I think a lot has changed and evolved. So I was just talking about this with some folks that do training courses. And, the thing with just AI content is the fast revving on it, right? So they want to instill best practices, which means if they're signing up to do MCP courseware or anything in AI, that you're signing up to rev pretty consistently to make sure those are continued to do best practices. I think to the question of like, where do you find the best practices? I think I look at like reference servers, like ones like from GitHub, for example, that I use a lot, or other ones that I'm looking at and that people are using at scale, that are open source. I think the more like very high quality MCP servers that are being used at scale, that are showing not just how to do tools, but how to use sampling, use prompts and resources in interesting ways, can help spark some curiosity and instill some best practices. I think that there is a lack of great samples and documentation and services out there today on OAuth. That's the number one question I get all the time. How do I do it? I'm like, oh, it's just OAuth 2, it's easy, just go ahead and do it. But I think that is something that will continue to evolve there. So as far as like finding it, I think that it's in a great place as far as like when I've been building and evolving with like the C# SDK as a C# developer, I've been able to really, continue to integrate some of the newer features. To me, I'm at the point where what are the best ways to deploy it? Right now, I'm deploying my MCP servers in like 4 different places because I'd like to teach all of them as well. But I think there's a lot of great courses that are out there. I know Kenzie Dodds and the community has been doing a lot of MCP work as well, which is really fantastic, and a bunch of other people as well. But I would go and I would look at, if you're really curious in building MCP servers, I'd be looking at the SDKs themselves, asking questions, getting involved in those communities. I think that's what I did when I started building mobile apps 15 years ago, getting involved with other people that are like, how do you build an iPhone app, right? And just people that were curious and looking at samples and references. And I think there's a swath of great samples out there and real production servers as well. So I think that's a nice thing about this, is that you can go and take a look at these really high quality servers and see what they're doing.
And I want to add to that, like, I think, sorry, well, like,
go for it.
Just like quickly to add to that, like, I think we would love to see in the community more like proper guides. Like, I would love to see someone write a guide of like how to deploy this in enterprise. How do I build an OAuth thing that does token exchange so that I get my backend API token and have a single sign-on? Because these things are possible, and I've seen them at scale. I've seen them in very big companies where you log in and you just have magically a token that just allows you to talk to any MCP server, and it does token exchange to the backend token that they require for the API. But there's no comprehensive guide of how to build this. And I would love for increasingly more contribution. And I think that's one of the best ways you can get into the MCP community, is by contributing documentation, building these guides. And they can be somewhat opinionated. I do not mind if the deployment you choose is an opinionated deployment of the product you might build. And that might be to some degree fine.
I was gonna ask, like, do you Do you all actually feel like there is currently anything such as like universal best practices? Because like I feel like with so many clients, like if it's not like something VS Code that is like basically has everything implemented, like you sort of have still a relatively fractured level of like support. But then also I feel like there's sort of three categories right now in my mind of like using MCP. There's sort of the like developer tools. There is the like consumer. I think one of the things we haven't talked about is like people building their own agents, like for like consumer, like customer service use cases, or like, for example, we have within our like speech-to-speech real-time API, like built-in remote MCP support where you can build full voice agents that can do like long-running MCP calls and we handle discovery and stuff. And so like I feel like for all of these sort of like there's like a lot of nuances still, like not necessarily just with MCP, but like overall with agents where like the harness plays so much into like how things get used effectively.
Yeah, it feels like a big part is fast evolution, so it's hard to keep up. And I think on the auth side, like there's actually more guidance that landed on the official website to have best practices, because it's a really hard problem, and you don't want to like people just basically figure it out along the way as they improve their security stance. So it should be coming right out of the box. But from the thing as a product manager, I see the general challenge, like if you design an MCP for an agent with a user, there's definitely a problem. Like what is the problem you're solving? Kind of what is the service you're providing? Is it like, as David said, like this potential pitfall of just exposing your API because it's too broad, it's not focus specific. So I see like people starting from like first principle, like these are the things people want to do with agents, and these are the things the agents are gonna do really well. That I think helps a lot, and really with a kind of user experience in mind and defining that. I think there's a larger gap. Like if I need to optimize my tool descriptions for MCP, I usually the Claude and has good documentation on the Anthropic website on how to write good tool descriptions. But on the MCP site itself, because it's model agnostic, of course you don't want to give too much guidance on like this is the perfect tool description, but it has to like include the when and how and some guidance on like a few things. So it might be more guidance there to validate against, maybe have some linting. But I think there's definitely some gaps here. Like one is that David mentioned that we are aware that we keep being asked about, like how can we benchmark our MCP? Because it's all vibes. Like you change the problem. It's like, oh, in my like one eval that I run, it now does the thing now 5 out of 10 times, so it's better.
Right.
So, but how do you do wild?
I feel like it's so funny because like so many of these things are like general AI problems as well, right? Like they're not necessarily like MCP problems. They're like, how do you deal with like building like or writing prompts, building agents that can like even switch between models from the same provider, right? Like let alone different harnesses with different base models.
Yeah, it's what I see is just a lot in the ecosystem, like just so much opportunity. There's so much opportunity now for people to get involved, to really make a difference within the ecosystem and help out with a lot of these holes that, again, it's just moving so fast. Like David said, right? Like you all move much faster than a lot of open source projects. AI generally moves faster than most technology projects. So I know we were talking about, Auth being, a big problem. So Jamie said, single sign-on, like any comments about this, any sort of.
Yeah, I think that should be possible. Like if this is not possible, then we screwed up. So the specification, and that's the change that we I think made in March or June, I forgot which one it was, with the help of a lot of the people in the authorization community, we have it made it such that an MCP server should be able to talk to what usually we refer to as an IDP, like an identity provider, which what a user would see as a single sign-on effectively is that's your Entra ID or your Auth0, whatever you use, or your Google sign-on. And you can configure it such a way that an MCP server will use that. And then it's a matter of your enterprise configuration to make sure this is all handled nicely. But MCP servers can do it, and we use this very actively. And I have seen very large deployments where you log in the morning into your AI system, you do a single sign-on, and afterwards you will be able to use MCP servers. And they will then get your token, your OAuth token, and they will then go back to the identity provider and exchange it to a token for the specific use case. And so that's all possible. But again, that there's a question just shows us that we need to do a better job in writing guides and educating people on how to do it, because it's the specification you should not have to read the specification unless you're a client implementer or a server implementer. Unarguable, if you're a server implementer, you should not be able to have to read it either. You should just, client implementers and SDK implementers should be the ones reading it, and everybody else should be able to find everything they need in guides and other documentation. And we need to get better at this. And I would love any help we can get in that area.
Love that. Love that. Thank you. And thank you, Jamie and Chris, both for those questions. So Dom, OpenAI, new releases, how does that all fit into the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, like I think we briefly touched on it a couple of times, but like overall, like I think we're very, like as it was mentioned before, like we're very engaged with like MCP, and have it spread throughout sort of like, I would say, every OpenAI tool at this point. Like whether you're using the APIs, you can use remote MCPs, whether you use like our new like agent builder to connect like data sources through that with MCP. Codex, our coding agent, supports MCP. But then I think like the biggest thing was the announcement last week of Apps SDK, which is a way for you to augment your MCP server to serve additional UI. Primarily right now in ChatGPT, but we're already seeing like other clients looking into like implementing this, and we're trying to make this like an open spec. It's not part of the MCP spec yet, but like we're trying to engage this in a very open ecosystem way, and have been like working with other folks like the MCP UI folks that have already added support within their system to support the same thing. But yeah, at a very high level, it's really an extension of MCP to render UI components that you can then engage with. So whether, like one example we showed at Dev Day last week was, you asking about like houses in a specific area, and like the Zillow MCP is able to like serve you an actual interactive map that you can engage with and actually feed context also back to the agent so that you can continue to have that conversation. And so it's not necessarily just like a visual way of like, here's a visual representation of this that could have been an image, but actually have like that engagement between the two. And then the other part of this is like the discoverability aspect. I think we talked a lot about this like so far, of how do you find like my mom is not going to go and like, find necessarily like an MCP server in the docs of Spotify or something, but instead like, having within ChatGPT the ability to like discover supported, trustworthy MCP connections that they can then leverage to augment their life, or even like get it more proactively, right? Like if you talk about wanting to learn something, that like you get like a suggestion to use the Coursera MCP, or if you ask about like a Spotify or like creating a playlist, like getting a suggestion to use the Spotify MCP to generate that playlist, and then being able to immediately engage from it there by getting like a nice visual representation of the playlist.
Yeah, there's so much. And all of y'all have sort of seen MCP being implemented. And so I think we know the struggles are like mainly around OAuth, but like what about success stories, and also just sort of standards that you've seen people starting to create, right? Like I think a lot of people are trying to do MCP, and sometimes it exists in sort of shadow IT parts of the organization. Yeah, just love to hear again, like success stories and just how it's been working for larger companies or just individual use cases you hear.
I can take a stab from like individual ones. I really like the work the Playwright team is doing. So we have a lot of kind of internal teams doing different work on MCP. And what's cool about it, we can collaborate closely with them to hear about their pain points, like their wish lists, like this is working, this isn't working, seeing their cool demos, like if we had this, we could do this, right? So there's a lot of communication, very close communication happening on bringing feedback. So Playwright has been really making sure that their stuff works across every client still. So it's really a broad range. But it just works, right? You open it, you add the Playwright MCP, and suddenly your agent will go out and run the tests, look at the website, take screenshots, tell you if the design works or not, click around. So like the end to end, I think it's just the quality of tool prompting, of like start with this tool, then you can use this tool, which is a hard problem in MCP, like getting the sequencing right and carrying it over. So I think that's the one that I find that delights me by just working. I never have to be super hacky. And you have a bunch of these MCPs which are like weirdly written, where the agent half of the time gets the arguments wrong because they're not well typed, or some authentication thing, or some other, it calls like a tool before and not after. So that quality is really what makes a kind of delightful experience where it's kind of magical. That's the one for me, I think.
I think one that I personally really love and have used recently a lot is like the Figma MCP server, but like specifically the local ones. Like if you run like the Figma application locally, and then using it with like something like Codex to be able to actually like highlight something in a design and then immediately be able to like talk to Codex to like pull that information and like implement it, like has been a really seamless integration of like, I think like the big thing there being really that it doesn't feel like it truly feels like a connection, right? Like between the two applications, as opposed to sort of like, sometimes APIs can feel a bit like more disconnected from sort of the user's life cycle, right? Like if I use like a Gmail API, for example, like it doesn't know which email I'm currently looking at. It's like truly stateless, versus like the Figma MCP thing that really makes it delightful for me is like the fact that like it has the context of what I'm currently looking at, what I'm highlighting, and that Codex can then actually leverage that as like the MCP client.
Yeah, I think of a few things. Like one of the cool things that I saw recently that I thought was such a cool win with MCP was with Scott Talinsky from like Syntax podcast and Sentry. And I thought what was neat is that Scott was running into this issue just around like how he wanted like CSS to be like formatted and used and best practices and all these things, and across any tool that he was using. So he just like built an MCP server to like do it and put it out into the world, and started using it in all of his editors. Like, oh, I have this problem, I need a universal plugin to do this, right? And you could have like, your rules files and instructions and things like that, but it was actually like a lot more involved than that. Basically, they could evolve and rapidly, and then you could provide prompts and resources and these other things. I thought that was so neat, is put out into the world. Hey, I have a problem, I can now solve it easily, and it plugs in everywhere as a developer. That's super powerful. And then I think to the point, just like Playwright, but I think also just the fact that two things are happening of interest. Like one is that when you start to use coding agents, whether you're using like a Codex, or you're using Copilot, or you're using CLIs like Claude or Codex or Copilot, all of them, right? Like you're starting now to see that MCP servers are there by default, right? Like the Copilot CLI makes sense. You're logging in with GitHub, so immediately the GitHub MCP server is there immediately, right? That makes sense. When you're running background coding agents, MCP servers are there for you automatically. Like when you're having a coding agent that has time to cook, right? It has time to then write tests, run tests, open the browser, bop around, do things for you, and report back in a very meaningful way and iterate on its work. And I think those things that almost is MCP work that's delivering better results for you and you don't know it is actually like a huge win. Like when a tool does something, but you don't know that the tool is doing the thing, that means it's working amazing. Like, I don't know how all of the plumbing behind the shower works, but it works and it's magic, and I don't have to worry about it until I just turn it on and it works, right? Water comes out and it's a magical experience for me to shower or to have a bath, right, or to wash my hands. So I think when those tools are working inherently behind the scenes, like it's really magic at the end of the day. And I think that I'm starting to see more of that deeper integration, and I think you kind of see that with what OpenAI is doing, these deeper integrations that are not necessarily, and they're hidden away from they're not hidden, but they're not there. They're presented in a unique way. And I think that makes sense. The user wants to do a thing. Let's have it do a thing and return the thing nicely there. The coding agent needs to do a thing. It has time. Let it do its thing with these tools that are now available in its toolkit to provide better results. So I think those are the things that I've seen, especially more recently. But I think the power of that documentation, samples of things are getting better, that you can go off and say, here's my problem. Let's go create an MCP that solves this problem for my company, for myself, or for more consumers or other developers out there. I think it is really unique. And then to be able to deploy that and have every single person be able to plug that in and use it, I think is extremely powerful. Just it itself, right? You see the registry is now popping up. You see the thousands of MCP servers, right, that are of interest there. Now it is pulling those together and solving some of these other problems that we've been talking about.
For me, it's like, I think along really three axes. I think as a developer, things like Playwright, MCP, I think really help a great deal with like testing of things. And I think that the combination of certain things like Playwright or remote things like Context 7 that are hard to do with CLI, those are really great. And then of course in CLI agents like Cloud Code, a lot of it would be MCP servers can also be done by CLIs, and it's equally good or to some degree sometimes even better, which is fine. I think that so Playwright I think is really a big unlock here for me at least in the development process. I think the second, and that's more on the enterprisey like work aspect is I've seen this, and I give you then later a more specific instance, but I've seen people have every department build specific MCP servers for their use cases, and then they log into like a chat platform at like a big company with a single sign-on, and then they get to interact with their systems through MCP. And I think that's a very cool integrations. I'm not allowed to mention specifics, but I think that kind of works. And like in particularly for me, how something similar shows up like that in the day-to-day life is I use Slack integration and I use Asana integration often to give me an overview of like what's going on since yesterday. I'm in the UK, like a lot of things happen in SF, like give me an overview, what's MCP related in Slack since yesterday, what has changed in Asana and the tickets and these type of things, and give me a very quick overview, and even organize things, move some of the things from the external GitHub MCP issues to internal Asana issues. And so there's a lot of that work that we use on a day-to-day basis internally. I mean, then personally for me, and just as interesting as fun is, I use this intersection. I have like, I got an invite to a company who's building a pretty good Slack bot that uses MCP servers extensively. And I have the MCP servers connected to my Google Calendar, and I have the MCP servers connected to my Aura ring, and I'm gonna add nutrition at some point, and then I have Claude build exercise plans and put them into Google Calendar, which is already doing just without nutrition values. I just need to provide those manually, but basically I have Claude being my personal trainer and nutritionist, And now I just need to figure out like how I get voice mode going so that Claude also yells at me when I don't do my reps. But beyond that, it's actually like quite magical. That it's just like I get my weekly schedule pulled into Google Calendar, and at 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm there doing my workout because Claude told me to.
I can just imagine though, if you could connect, like, so your Ring detects that you didn't do the workout, and so your computer refuses to turn on.
Well, that would be next level, but like I can definitely like Claude can definitely tell that I haven't done my workout and that I might need to go back the next day again.
I love that so much. That's so good. Thank you for just sharing that personal story, because I think that really brings us to light on just how practical, right, something like this is. So we've sort of talked a little bit. We've alluded to things like, okay, how sort of use cases have been evolving as the specs have been evolving. So whether it's like agent-based with MCP hidden from users, right? I mean, David, you alluded to the Cloudflare blog post and sort of like new patterns that are evolving. Do we all just want to sort of talk a little bit about that, like new patterns, new use cases? What are we seeing in the communities?
Yeah, I think like the two big use cases, patterns that are on top. I think Apps SDK is practically a pattern on top of MCP. It doesn't use anything. It doesn't add anything particularly except for like a few meta fields, which are exactly what they're for. And that's just a pattern. I think that's a very good, like a very smart pattern that does something very useful to people. And so I think that's one of these. I think people figuring out that they can use tools and composite tools and code together, I think is the other one that's quite natural in a way, because going for every tool call back to inference is costly and costs you token and time. And I think if you can optimize this as much as possible, then that's, I think, a net positive for everyone. And I think we will see increasing use of this kind of work. And I'm curious, I'm sure there will be other patterns on top of it in the future as well. I think we will see increasingly these type of like creative combinations of the underlying blocks. I'm not aware of something particularly in the works beyond these two, but I think those two, and Apps SDK, just for reference, is very deeply inspired by MCP UI, which is Ido and Liad's work, which really like defined the type of pattern, and then is a good iteration on top of that. But I'm curious what other people have seen, if there are other patterns that people have seen emerge slowly that I might need to be aware of.
I think those are the two that I'm most excited about. Like I think like the work around like code mode from Cloudflare and like being able to like chain tool calls more together, I think is a great option. I'm also curious to see sort of like, I don't know if anyone has seen anything, but like it's still to a degree like at the will of the model, but like I think being able to like make it easier for like a client, for example, to define sort of like what the flows are of like tool calls that like make sense in combination, to like still keep that versatility of the overall MCP server, but like at the same time like have a bit more control on the client side. Like the way I'm thinking about it is like I worked at Twilio before, and like we had a REST API, right, that had like a tool to search for available phone numbers and then purchase a phone number, and like there were like all of these like different tools, and then you had to like configure it, and like there were all of these like different API calls that you would have to make in sequence if you just wanted to get a random phone number that like is configured for your application. I think in a similar way, like having like with things like code mode, it makes it much easier for the agent to do it, but it's still a bit at the will of the model versus like providing ways to bring those together. But maybe I've missed like someone already having solved that problem.
I think on top of that, I think the other aspect similar to tool calling as a combination of things, I think, and maybe there's a lack in the protocol yet, but I'm not quite sure. But I think you will see people use resources increasingly as a remote file system. And then if you consider code, and models can write code that interacts with file systems very, very well. And I think that's another pattern you will see in the future. Like you will see models writing code that reads a Panda data frame from a remote MCP server, for example, and then interact with that Panda data frame for you, and which is a different thing than doing it via tool call.
Yeah, the resource one would also be one I was talking about. Now we have also resource links and resources. So it gives you more fine-grained ways. Like, do you want to attach it? Does it need to be in context, or is it something the agent needs to look up? So, which is very nuanced. Like, it's not just out of the box to say, oh, I need resources here. So it is I think it goes back to like best practices. Like, when do you do what? And working a lot with like the Figma came up as we had SP server. So we're talking to them like, hey, you have all these things that should be resources. Like, you want to try this out, and then make it clickable in the editors. Like, what is the interaction pattern in the UI for the user? What is the interaction pattern for the agent? So there's a bunch of things figured out, but I think it's nice to see resources now being used more, and the GitHub MCP server also exposed them a lot more now, which gives you this ability to, like, I want to fetch an issue, but I don't want to then click onto the link to actually read the issue after the LLM gave it back to me, but I just click the resource and I have it because I'll just mark down and see it in my editor or see the image from Playwright. So there's a bunch of really interesting use cases there that it goes back to like how you design an MCP interaction. So that's nice to see that value is unlocked by more clients supporting it, and by server developers finding the sweet spot of where to use it.
And don't forget, you can expose the same data twice. You can do it via tool and via resource. There's nothing stopping you. I'm like, it's very simple to just have the same raw data in a resource on the same server and expose it, the specific subset of it via a tool that you require. Like, can also do that.
I think I'm seeing from like a use standpoint, some things sort of changing, at least how I use some MCPs in general, which is a lot of just like custom reusable prompts in my prompts folder, which is it's almost like automation, right? There are things that I can automate with different tools, like that are running like, almost cron job-esque or whatever. There's things that I'm doing part of my job that needs to connect, right? I need to convert files. I need to run these tests. I need to go scrape data from GitHub, and I need to do stuff. David was kind of talking about that. And like, maybe I don't want it to run in an agent form, but I want to run it part of my like daily routine. So I'm actually chaining a bunch of different, commands, basically tool calls and different things there. But I think what's unique there is that becomes, things that MCP servers can actually put as prompts that are inside of the MCP server. So for example, like what I'm seeing are sort of the best practices that can be consumed. Like actually the Azure MCP server has a bunch of best practice calls that are like super specific of how do you actually best practice authentication, configuration, security, networking, and things. And you can chain together that all yourself and ask it, but you can actually just have a prompt that's like, hey, here's basically a prompt that's going to show you a best practices of querying best practices, and then implement the best practices for you. So we can guide, users or developers down this way of having prompts back. And the best practices are really unique too, because we think of the I want to go grab something, or I want to go do something. Like what I'm really interested in is discovering best practices, how my thing is currently configured today, what is the best practice, what are the fixes, and chaining those things together and have it do sampling back and forth. That's some of the servers that I've seen recently that have done really unique things as well. And I think beyond that, I think MCP and the UI aspect of it become really interesting, which is having it not actually, in some ways, I'm really interested in a bunch of designs. Like, can I have it just like present the design back in the chat for me and not actually like mess with my code? you have my code, you could do some things. I think there's some unique potential opportunities there to help us stay in the flow better. So I think all those scenarios, what I think is unique is that it's this tool in this toolbox help me stay in the flow, whether I'm in Claude Desktop, whether I'm in Claude Code, whether I'm in VS Code, whether I'm in you know, ChatGPT, whatever I'm in, right? These things are helping me stay in the flow in the tool that I'm using and help me automate things in different ways. So I'm kind of interested in how those things will evolve, and the patterns that will come from it. Because I didn't think I would be creating a prompt that would help me scaffold out our release notes for every .NET release, for example. And yet, sure enough, there is this big, beautiful prompt that is sitting there in our repo that's like, we have a new release coming, do it. And it's like, we'll go off and just query all these things and get all this context and then scaffold everything out. And that's something I wasn't doing a year ago. And I was doing manually, hours every single release. And now it's minutes. And it's I think when you see that in action, it just kind of blows your mind that some of these new patterns and capabilities are just waiting to be prompted.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the adoption of all of the different AI technologies, you know, in talking to a lot of different companies who are, you know, on different levels or different areas of their path to adoption, right? I think one of the things that is apparent and sort of what I think is sort of a standard that people need to start doing is just, you know, creating the sort of like small efficiencies or the small sort of bits of, okay, I'm going to adopt this here and do the small thing here. And then, you know, collectively over a period of time, that means, okay, now we've sort of like gone into the new era of where we need to be. But I think a lot of companies sort of get stuck on this, like, well, how do we do it? And what do we need to do? We need it all at once, right? But like, just doesn't, it doesn't work that way. So James, you sharing that is just sort of just like a very practical and also amazing and transformational way to figure out how to use these new technologies.
Yeah.
We did talk about why not more CLIs. I remember us talking that during the during the prep call. Anybody want to comment? So David, you're muted.
Can you explain the problem to people so that they understand what you mean by this statement?
I'm not going to be the best person to explain the problem statement, but I will leave it all up to you all.
I think there's two things, David, that I hear, which is, why can't I just take my API? Why can't the LLM? Why can't my API just be it, right? It's just APIs, right? And then there's other thing, which is like, well, the CLI is also kind of like an API. It's commands it can run. Why can't it just be that? You hear that. Why do we have yet another thing? And I think what I talk about, at least when I talk about CLIs, I think everything has its own place and purpose, and CLIs are great, and APIs are great, and MCP is great. But also the fact that when it comes to APIs, or it comes to the inputs and outputs, or the CLI inputs and outputs, you know, inherently these clients and models can call commands from CLIs, right? And these things are all going to be changing, and we'll have another context 7, but for CLIs, right? That we'll have to figure out there. But also realizing that it's not, I think it is something that you're like, if you're a developer, you're like, yeah, why isn't it just calling CLI stuff? Like, what couldn't I just have the GitHub CLI? Like, it's just there. And the difference is that I am running these MCPs in like 18 different places. I'm running them in some magical like automation software. I'm running it, you know, inside of VS Code. I'm running it inside of my CLI. I'm connecting to them inside of coding agents running on a bunch of different services. And that's, to me, is the magic of, I don't know what those machines are. And then I don't know if they're Linux, if they're a Mac machine, if they're Windows machine, right? And I don't want to have to worry about that, right? And I think that's some of the magic that at least the protocol enables of not having to worry about the infrastructure that it's running on. So at least that's how I kind of look at it. I don't know about if that helps, at least what I've heard, David, a little bit of clarifying the question a little bit, and at least my answer.
Yeah. I think for me, like the CLI question is like, yeah, I agree with all of that. I think the in principle, like the CLIs do work pretty well in certain circumstances, and I think there's a way for like, why wouldn't you use a CLI? But you know, CLIs are very hard to execute on the web, so I think that's one of these aspects, for example. So it's not that universal anymore. It works great in coding agents, and there's nothing bad about using it there. And they actually have an interesting property that's like auto discoverability from the model, which is actually something MCP like would have to implement would have to be manually implemented to the client, which we should do. So I do think CLIs in that regard are not a bad thing, but they're very specific use case, and I think MCP is more general than that. The other thing is that CLI tools don't unify authorization, which is the big other part, right? Like we are opinionated about authorization, which makes it sometimes difficult and makes a lot of things very, very nice if you have the same expectations everywhere. And that's the same way why API, like OpenAPI specs don't work as well. You can make the argument if you ignore resources and only focus on tools, but but there you will have like every of them have a different authorization mechanism. So you might need to pre-register a client secret and these type of things. And so it's very, very hard to actually put in practice. I think if people try, it's not as easy and as straightforward as it might seem. And particularly it's limited to only tools in the end of the day, and it does not provide anything beyond that. And so I think there is the thing that MCP adds to that is really have a very clear description of the semantics of these different endpoints that these other things don't have. And that's why they're always basically narrowed down to tools and tools only.
Yeah, I see the problem usually so first off, if your problem is solved by using a CLI for your local code editor, it's awesome. If you run an agent that has the access, it runs on your local machine, and it does CLI, and it works well. That's good. The challenge I see is one is like it's mostly based on training data at this point. Like, oh, my model is amazing at running GH commands, yeah, because like it has seen many of those. But once there's like a new area in that CLI command, I rarely see my agent like running a wrong command. It just keeps making up stuff and guessing, so they're not yet easily trained on like, oh, I should look at the man pages or look at --help and do discovery. So the discovery isn't baked in automatically, so you would need to custom prompt that or do something else around that. But yeah, the big problem is like this: if you limit it to MCP on that local space, it works. And then I think mostly it's probably also a maintainer question. Like if you have a developer product, like do you need to ship a CLI and an MCP? Probably yes, if you want to reach every MCP client, that because most of them eventually want to have some terminal to run stuff in, and that's I think the main takeaway. Like it's just reach.
I think it's also not.
Go, Dominik.
I also don't think it's like always like either or. Like I think Playwright is a good example of like the Playwright MCP is like really helpful if you have like one-off tasks, right? Like you throw it in and like your agent will like handle the rest. But like if you, for example, see like your agent struggling to do this repetitive task, like maybe you want like a screenshot of like a very specific component all the time, like just wrap that in like a CLI command and like give that to like your agent if your agent can like run CLI commands, for example. Like if you're using Codex or Cursor or Cloud Code or VS Code or any of those, like you might as well do both.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to like what we initially talked about, the scope increase of MCP, where in the original version, when you focus on developers, I think there's a lot of arguments of like alternative approaches that work very well. But for example, I increasingly use MCP via my phone. And that's back to like their CLIs are very, very difficult to use. And that's where MCP, I think, is good. And I think as we see more and more remote MCP servers, I think that the argument will just get stronger. But again, I don't think, but I think to Dominik's case, and it's like, there's no one size fits all. And I don't think MCP wants to be that either. We want to be like a good addition to the ecosystem. And I feel we're doing a reasonable job at it, but I don't think we need to be the only one.
The registry. Can we talk about the registry? What is the state of it? Yeah. I think I actually shared with somebody the registry, and they were like, well, is this official? So
there's many layers of official. So we just had a VS Code live stream this morning, and Toby on the GitHub site, he talked about registry. I did give the intro. So basically, if you look at github.com/model context protocol/registry, that's where kind of the official registry is being built, which is an official like code base that actually runs the official registry, plus defines kind of the spec of the endpoints of how clients should discover from the registry as well. There's other layers, like there's the MCP bundle spec that kind of bleeds into it a bit. So there's multiple places where things are being defined. But overall, it's about this, like, can installing MCPs just be a one-click experience? Like in the client, you have a nice representation of the MCP, like you're looking for, I need an MCP for Git, we need an MCP for taking screenshots. Like I have a use case, how do I find it? And in VS Code, that's how you did it for the longest time with extensions. You wanted a Python extension, you got a Python extension, and you didn't worry about editing JSON files and finding the right repo on GitHub where the Python extension lived. And that's, I think, what everybody wants, like this like fluid end user experience of discovery of what is the installation happen, what does it need to be configured, and that end to end is kind of what that information from the registry is driving. And I think the latest, so there is an official registry that's in preview basically on the Model Codex protocol site, and it's been actually growing massively. So there's a lot of contributions, people actually submitting. I think just this week or last week was like the V0.1 cut. Maybe we can talk to that, but there is like the spec is now final, and actually on the GitHub side, we have the GitHub MCP registry. It's github.com/MCP, where we took that spec and implemented kind of the GitHub counterpart to that. And the goal is to have a federated system eventually of registries, so you don't have to submit to all of them as a developer, but then as a client you'll have options to, like, oh, I want to have the medical HIPAA compliant MCP list from like this one authority that reviews them all, or I want to have the one that comes from my internal MCP registry that we put up as an enterprise, where we have our own MCPs that we built internally. So it provides this nice kind of ecosystem layer that you have choices. People can still figure out what is the right security, the right trust layers in their registries, but also provide kind of the growth to, you have a place to find all the MCPs. So that's my pitch. Take it right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty right. Like, in the end of the day, what we were like, but at the absence of a centralized registry, there was like an evolution of 25, 35 registries, to the point where we had memes about registry of registries because there were so many registries now. And I think it is useful to have a central registry of servers, but with a central registry, it's a very similar problem to the same problem that NPM and others and PyPy and other like common central registries face, is that it's fairly uncurated and very open. And I think that's the approach that like an official open source registry needs to take. But then on top of that, I think there's a value proposition where people like GitHub, where like companies like GitHub or other companies might offer a more curated experience to their user base, that might be either, because they've curated it, because they had because it only shows the ones from their platforms, or only for their products, or whatever it might be. And I think these are great use cases. And our goal was to make sure that we're building a central registry with a specification that hopefully every client and every registry adheres to, such that it becomes fairly easy, particularly for enterprises, to go and build an internal registry and just plug it into any client that they have, because every enterprise in the end of the day wants to rely on whatever their security team has accepted, and not and maybe in a combination with some other external like registry that they feel are trustworthy, but they certainly don't want to like open it up to just about everything. And so that's really the goal here. Have one central point for everyone, and then allow companies to build curated things on top of it, or build private registry on top of it where it's needed.
The registry is, I think, one of the most exciting parts. Every part of MCP is very exciting, but I think, as someone that's been podcasting for about 20 years, And if you've ever created a podcast, it is basically a nightmare to actually launch your podcast because you have to submit your podcast. Now there is a standardization, it's called RSS, right? But even that for podcasting is not standard. There's a bajillion tags and all sorts of things. And that's just for audio. And we're not even talking video for video podcasts. But the standardization even of RSS and how it's sort of been, manipulated with different tags and different features for every single client that wants to consume it. And everybody is hoping that standardization doesn't change and that every single author, these podcast hosts will adhere to different standards and make sure it shows up correct. As a podcast creator, you either have to go manually submit this to like 15 to 20 different places that's out there, hope that your hosting platform connects automatically, and then figure out what to do with video next. It's very strange because actually what has happened in that world is that the Apple podcast feed has become the unofficial registry, but not the official registry, but not actually a registry that you can rely on out there today. So when I think of this for me as an MCP developer, I now am able to really have this standardization that, my MCP servers just legitimately, I ran, the prompt that was given in the registry and boom, it was there. And now I can go to everywhere that can adhere to it, right? Or people can do additional filters on top of it. And I think like having gone through the struggles of the last 20 years, as I even continuously launch new podcasts, like for the VS Code team, it's like I'm reliving my worst nightmare every time I launch a podcast. And to me, having the standardization that everybody can adhere to, even the clients can adhere to and suck in, you can swap between the feeds, especially in the enterprise, I think is just honestly a game changer for developers and for users. I mean, now when I go in and I can go in and just, go into the client, go into VS Code and hit the button that says, boom, search, and boom, install. The barrier, the wall of entry, the barrier of entry is so much lowered, right? And when we get, those beautiful icons, right, we get that as well. So I think it's really delightful that this became part of sort of a specification that the committee took on because it is such a problem that I think is now being solved, and it is delightful to see so many projects. I just love when I do very minimal work and I can see my work be highlighted in so many places. I think that's really, really unique. And I think MCP creators, server creators hopefully will be delighted by that as well.
Yeah, well, amazing. Thank you for that. So it's a github.com/model context protocol /registry if you wanted to check that out. There's also this like explosion of third-party MCPs, of course, versus official hosted MCPs. There's a lot of like conversations about like running MCPs locally versus official providers hosting their own MCP. Is there any sort of vision or thoughts on where this ends up or goes?
The magic of open source. Yeah, the magic of MCP, of just doing it. I think that's like I have a few MCP servers that I tried out that were bootstrapped during the hype days and then were dropped and didn't get maintenance, but were the official ones. It's like basically they check the box. We now have an MCP, and it's not a good MCP. Like the tool descriptions are not good. It's barely being used. The arguments are not good. So I think that's where but then there's 5 community MCPs that do a better job because there's APIs and you can just make your own. So I think it's a great signal for anybody who work on MCP that like if your MCP has a lot of community MCPs, there's probably a lot to learn of what you can bring back. So that's what I would recommend as a signal. But otherwise, it's just part of the MCP ecosystem. It's so easy to make your own and just put it on GitHub and do it yourself. Like the thing that David did, I had to analyze a survey. I made an MCP that samples data from a CSV, throws it into context, runs it in basically sub-agent style, and analyzed like 50 times the same samples. And I could write an agent, stuff like that, but I could just do it in VS Code and have my custom MCP. So there's a lot of, because if there's no MCP for that yet, or if the MCP that's out there doesn't solve it the way I want to solve it, just do it. And as an example, maybe on enterprise side, I see some companies taking, for example, the GitHub MCP server is open source. It's in Go. So some just took it in, like we only need that subset and we want to have it work slightly different. And they just run that version in their MCP gateway that they have internally. So there's also that happening. So I think that's also what open source unlocks is people, again, taking your project and then either like slightly diverging it into how they need it or reducing it down. And that's, again, a good signal for me as an MCP maintainer, like, oh, that maybe is a use case I need to support. So I think this is all goodness, right?
I would also think about like third party or community MCPs, like the same way that like you pick like an SDK to interact with any API, right? Like, if you're like browsing NPM, there's like often a lot of like other, like I think GitHub was this famously like like a few years ago where there was like community SDK that was like much more beloved by some people than like the official one. For example, I think they converged eventually, but like you know, look at like if it's a community one, like it better be open source, I would say. Like don't use it if it's not open source, but then like look at it and sort of like inspect whether it makes sense for you, whether you feel comfortable giving it like credentials. Especially
from my perspective, I think I would love to see more and more official MCP servers that are hosted, mostly for consumers, under the assumption that they're very, very well written and very well maintained. I'd love to see that, but I do love that that there is this mix and match, and for that, whatever you like and whatever is suitable for you. Like there's people who love local models and feel very strongly about the data, where it goes and how it flows. And for them, like local MCP servers that are not the official ones might just be the way to go. And that's perfectly fine. And for a consumer that wants to connect, I don't know, like Shopify, whatever, to like buy something off Shopify via MCP, for them, the official integrations might be way better. And so, I think this is not a one size fits all. And I've been in the open source community for like 25 years or something like that. And I always love that it just, everything exists, and, both is equally fine to me. I just want high quality, well-maintained servers. And where they come from is secondary.
Yeah, I still remember, we built a DocuSign MCP recently, and it was so cool, right, to be able to just, open up a chat and just talk about your documents, your contracts, with connecting to DocuSign. And I think it's really cool just to see how we interface with the things that we're just so used to, for so many years, and how that changes our experience and the consumer experience and the developer experience overall. So love it. Thank you for that. The sort of like comments around third-party MCPs and MCPs generally. Fast forward 2 years, what would you guys hope to see if we were talking about state of MCP, and any sort of like aspirations?
Thinking years in the AI space. So what about in 2 months? I don't know. I wish at some point it's like HTTP, HTML, like it becomes table stakes.
Guys,
right?
It's like, God, I remember when I went to an API conference. It was like, there's these things and they're called APIs, and it's so cool. And now it's like there's no API conference.
I mean, I would definitely love to, as David said, like see more hosted like official MCPs, like and especially more that are like not developer specific ones. Like I would love to see more of sort of like the community, like the consumer ecosystem embrace MCPs. And like I think that ultimately also gives everyone more freedom of like being able to stitch together things. I think especially where like historically a company might have not necessarily offered an API.
I think in my most optimistic hope, I do hope that either MCP or something like MCP is the equivalent to websites today, but for agent. And I don't feel strongly that it must be MCP. Like I just want rather a standard to emerge rather than different proprietary systems, because I do believe in the approach for open standards. And of course, I do hope that that MCP plays a big role in that. But beyond that, if that's a bit too high hopes, I just do hope that there will be lots of MCP servers that most people don't know exist, that just do good, valuable stuff every day without having to worry about it. They should just feel like magic incantations that the model does, and that you trust that it's doing it the right way, and that never fail, and just get the job done for the specific environment and that you're in. Because that's the idea behind it all, is like have something that fits your environment, the things you require as a person, the things that you require as a person in your personal life, but also in a work environment are different. And then be just good at that and help me, right? Like I want to talk to Claude and be my personal assistant for everything, and hopefully it's powered with MCP under the hood, but I shouldn't have to care if that's MCP or not MCP.
Do you feel like the spec is going to continue to evolve, or do you think there's going to be at a point in time in which it reaches maturity and just sort of stays the way it is?
Some of the best technologies generally somewhat boring, and I think at some point there will be and I don't think it's actually that far away. I think some of the best specification know when where to stop, and some of the best protocols know where to stop. I think the power of MCP lays in composability and building these patterns that we're slowly seeing to emerge on top of it, rather than extending the semantics of the protocol for every little use case. And so I do think that the specification will slow down, and I think it needs to slow down for like really, really wide enterprise adoption. And I think we're fine with that. I think there are one or two little additions or medium-sized additions we want to make that I see on the horizon. But beyond that, I feel we will get very quickly to a point where we're somewhat getting slower. And because we are lucky in that regard that we have this luxury that on the other side, there's like a machine intelligence that can solve a lot of the things for us that otherwise in traditional protocol development you would have to put semantically into the protocol, which we can just hand wave away because the model will solve it for us. And that's I think a lot of the power and a lot of the beauty. And so yeah, I think it will slow down. I think it will. I think it's close to what I think it should do.
I'm so curious to see how that evolves. You know, I feel like just sort of being involved in GraphQL, you know, back in the day, right? And you know, there was this explosion of like GraphQL, everybody's talking about GraphQL. You know, the spec is sort of, you know, still being you know, created and evolved and things like that. And then it got to this point where it was like, well, we don't want to, you know, Meta was just like, we don't want to, you know, evolve out of it. This is exactly what it's supposed to be. And then all of a sudden, like all the sort of buzz and, you know, potentially even adoption, right? I mean, you only see what you see on the internet, so who knows? But it definitely seemed like all of a sudden the buzz around it, or, you know, I mean, people were like, oh, GraphQL is dead. And so I'm just so curious on, you know, and that's just one example. I'm sure there's a million other examples of that, but I'm curious to see, I guess, just like what happens with MCP, right? Like,
yeah, I think the counterexample to that is, for example, LSP. I think LSP is not very fast moving. It's very, very, very slow evolving. Like there's probably like a method or two, like every 2-3 years, and it's working just fine. And every time you open an editor, and every time you see like auto completion from the in your Rust code or in your JavaScript code, it's through that protocol, and it works just perfectly fine. And so I think both can be true. So we'll see how it goes. For me, the main hope is that in the end of the day, there's an open standard, and what that is specific is, I hope it's MCP, but it doesn't have to be.
I think the thing with GraphQL was also that like a lot of the buzz came from people thinking there is like opportunities for brand new businesses that were like drastically changing how everything else worked. And like, I think that is always the part that like gets loud, where like it wasn't necessarily like people talking about how like it was like game changing for their business. It was like game changing for the existence of their business. And I think like that's very different now with like MCP, where people are actually like the most vocal people, I would say, are the people who use it regularly, not necessarily the people who are trying to like, there's like a bunch of MCP startups, but they're not necessarily the most vocal ones.
Well, I think you see the value like immediately as well, right? When, as you're saying, Dom, is like a lot of the vocal, folks out there are users of it, right? Because you see the value of it, and you want more people to see the value of it. And I think kind of like to the hopes and dreams, like as the protocol matures, I think David had a great point, which is like I talked to a lot of enterprises, and a lot of enterprises don't want to adopt in their minds what maybe is marked with a preview, or it's like evolving or can change at any time, right? So when we can get past these barriers and see more broad adoption, not just in people creating MCPs or adopting at their enterprises, but actually like having it, throughout your entire operating system experience, right? Wouldn't it be delightful to be on your Mac or Linux or Windows machine? And we were talking about that single sign-on process. We think like all the apps, like just why can't I open Claude Desktop or open VS Code or open another tool and just everything is there and ready? And then the clients, right? It's a lot comes down to the clients, right? What is the client experience now that everything can be brought up? So my hope, like, as things continue to mature, is like you see that level across all the different clients, and maybe the operating system at a level, right, is really looped in. And we've seen some of that announcements around Windows itself at like build time frame, but like that would be delightful, because to me, I think the high quality servers that are not just for developers, I'm constantly in my mind thinking all the time, man, I wish I could just go do this thing right now in the editor or the tool or the chat tool that I'm in right now in this moment, and I can't, right? So I think unlocking those capabilities will continue to see the adoption of it as the matures. But I think people that use it, I think that's, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I'm really interested, like I think what I tell everyone that they see it, I'm like, just go try it, right? Every time you're like, oh, I wish I could do that thing. See if there's an MCP server like in your chat right now that you can connect to and then do a thing. And if not, especially at your company, can you build that thing to find value immediately? Just like you used to create APIs or create a new desktop application, like inside of these experiences, are you able to unlock some value there? And I think it's a great tool in the toolbox.
Yeah. To add, I think eventually, like maybe the next big upgrade is just like HTTP 1.1 to HTTP 2. Like it suddenly got streaming and multiplexing, and like nobody who used websites cared. it just worked. Yeah. Websites got faster. Like things got better, more reliable on mobile. Like just all these like benefits that came out of it, but nobody really cared about the underlying spec, whether the servers are updated or not. But for me, like the tier question, I think goes back to like the question of like the scale, trust, and kind of the security aspects, where I feel like a lot of right now tools are basically wide open. There's no sense of like what scope do they have? Can I reduce it? This whole problem of like a lot of the MCP usage will not be actually humans using MCP. It'll probably be agents using MCP or agents talking to agents powered by MCP as a protocol. So it's a bunch of that has to be evolved in the protocol, but also evolved in the ecosystem, like the whole security problem of prompt injection. Can I just use any MCP on the internet? Can I validate that the tools are not doing something nefarious? Can I validate that the tools don't return anything nefarious? Like, is it open world? Is it something from GitHub? Is it something from our internal system that I can fully trust? So all these layers are not necessarily in the protocol, but also in how you run the MCP and the extra security constraints you put on top. So it's not necessarily on the, what's interesting, it's not on the protocol to solve. So there's an opportunity, many opportunities to innovate and to provide more controls as you provide these MCP gateways, or for the clients, like should VS Code warn you that an MCP looks odd because the tools don't really align with what it's supposed to do. So there's a bunch of innovation that has to happen to really build that trust. So you come into a conversation, and then when you say the word MCP, not half the audience is like, ooh, scary. But half the audience is like, oh, this is the place where it has the right security controls. It has I feel comfortable because I can set the right things. I'm comfortable because out of the box, there's a level of security. It has the right scopes. There's the whole idea of agent identity. There's a bunch of things to figure out to make people feel comfortable. But all these conversations are happening, and people are innovating in the ecosystem, but it takes time.
Yes, especially enterprises, right? I mean, nobody's watching nobody's watching at the speed, and executives are not watching at the speed of what's happening within the AI ecosystem. They just hear that 3 months ago, it was not a good idea, and then now all of a sudden the spec has changed to make it okay and secure, and they're not following that, right? It's sort of like a nine months later they realize that oh, well, I guess we can do this now, and then it goes on the roadmap, and then 2 years later. So adoption could definitely be slow. Well, this was just such a meaningful and interesting conversation, y'all. Thank you so much for spending time. Everybody listening, I hope you guys got a lot of value out of it. It's really not often, unless you are in the Bay Area, to be able to just have these amazing conversations. So all of these folks are on the internet. I'm going to start with David first, since I started with you first earlier. Where do we find you on the internet?
Mostly on Twitter these days,
Okay.
at @DSP_. I do technically have a blog that I have not written a single blog on since I joined Anthropic. So you get one blog post every 2 years. So that's about it. Yeah.
Harald, you were second, I believe.
Yeah. Digitarald, the hardest to pronounce name I picked. And that's on GitHub, X. I'm also joining the VS Code live stream. Just this morning, I jumped over here from a VS Code live stream. We just had a release. So youtube.com/code is also where we publish our stuff, but otherwise also blogging on the VS Code blog. And you can find me at GitHub Universe, as we talked about in the beginning, right? So that's where we're all gonna meet up again.
So register, come check it out. Great opportunity to visit San Francisco. There is a MCP Universe on Tuesday night. I do not have the link. I don't even know how I got the link, but there is an MCP Universe happening. So check that out as well. We'll all be there. James, what about you?
There's only one of me, James Montemagno. So you can find me just by Googling that, just at James Montemagno everywhere. I do a lot of YouTube on the VS Code channel and the .NET channels as a .NET developer, and a lot of stuff on my own personal YouTube as well. And then on Twitter and LinkedIn and all that jazz. But if you are using VS Code and interested in going behind the scenes, Harald was just a guest on the VS Code podcast. You just look for VS Code podcast. It's like a behind the scenes with the engineering and PM teams, kind of the inner workings of VS Code that we started up not too long ago. So you can find me there. Like Harald said, we do that. And we do a fun show on the VS Code YouTube on Fridays called Let It Cook, where we let the models cook up some code and show off all the latest stuff. So whenever there's new features, we're always highlighting it and bringing guests on as well. So that's super fun. And I'll be at GitHub Universe as well. Actually, we'll be running, if you're there, we're running the vibe coding booth. We're bringing it back. We'll be vibe coding for 8 hours a day with different folks, and just using the tools, using the MCP servers, doing a whole bunch of fun stuff, and keep the vibes high.
I hope it's very heavily themed, vibing or right.
Oh, it's
I sunglasses. I don't know. Just
listen. We did it at Build, and the GitHub, the crack marketing team at GitHub. It is the most beautiful booth that I've ever seen. It's crazy. It's just absolutely stunning. So I'm super excited about it. Yeah.
Can't wait. And Dom, you're last.
Yeah, I think everywhere D Kundel. So should be easy to find. Twitter, LinkedIn, GitHub.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. And you can follow me on X at Lady Lead, or on LinkedIn at Tracy Lee. We do an AI workshop as well. If you sort of want to get advanced into using AI coding tools, you can check it out, ai.this.co/workshops. So if you really want to get into subagents and spec-driven development, those are things that we we're really passionate about helping developers do now. So also check out our YouTube channel, this.media. We'll be doing a lot of sort of more, there's a lot of content around AI right now, but we'll be doing a lot more AI content as the industry has evolved into all of that, basically. But this is where the fun stuff is. So thank you again all for such an energizing conversation. Definitely give these guys a follow and bug them. And, now opportunities and ways to contribute to the ecosystem. So I hope you all get started today, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.